I've spent years studying something so unsettling, so fundamentally human, that even now it shakes me to talk about it. I've seen transformations that don't just change lives, they redefine what we believe human nature is capable of. It began with a pattern among people I once thought of as the gentlest souls. The empaths, the caretakers, the ones who feel everything too deeply. These were people who came to me shattered, convinced they were broken beyond repair, but beneath that fragility was something else, something waiting to awaken. I started calling them the awakened one, the pattern that shouldn't exist. Over decades of clinical work, particularly at the Zurich Clinic, I began noticing something that defied explanation. Again and again, I met people who'd spent their lives absorbing everyone else's pain. Children of alcoholics, partners of cheaters, friends of the chronically self-destructive. They were the emotional shock absorbers of their worlds. They carried bruises they explained away. They blamed themselves for everything. They apologized for existing, but under all that guilt and gentleness there was something extraordinary. A psychological mechanism I hadn't seen before. Because these people weren't just feeling deeply, they were studying the hidden genius of empaths. What I began to realize was that empaths were not weak victims of circumstance. They were observers, quiet, meticulous, impossibly perceptive observers. Every time someone hurt them, they took notes. Not consciously, but precisely. They remembered how that person moved when they lied, how their tone changed when they were hiding something, how their breathing shifted when they felt cornered. They remembered everything. Over time, these empaths developed something astonishing. A mental map of human behavior so intricate it could rival the work of trained psychologists. They could recognize insecurities, fears, and emotional triggers in others without a single word being spoken. When I tested this theory, I was stunned. I'd bring new colleagues into the clinic, people these empaths had never met, and within minutes my patients could describe their childhood wounds, relationship struggles, and inner conflicts with unnerving accuracy. They weren't psychic. They were paying attention. At a level most humans never reach, intuition as data. Society likes to call this kind of insight intuition. But for empaths, intuition is just data collection without permission. They absorb everything, the micro-expressions, the energy shifts, the silences, and translate it instantly into understanding. Their brains process emotional information the way mathematicians process numbers. And yet, instead of being celebrated for this, empaths are punished for it. When they point out inconsistencies, they're told they're overreacting. When they see through manipulation, they're labeled paranoid or too sensitive. So they learn to doubt themselves, to silence their perceptions, to apologize for their accuracy. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't disappear when you stop speaking it. It just accumulates. And in the empaths I studied, it built up for decades until something inside them finally snapped. When the snap comes, when these people reach their breaking point, it didn't happen gradually. It happened all at once, in what I came to call the clarity event. And the trigger was almost always the same. Betrayal. Not the kind of betrayal that stings for a week, the kind that shatters trust at its foundation. A partner's infidelity, a friend's deception, a family member's cruelty, and the worst part, they had seen it coming. They had noticed every sign, every inconsistency, every lie, but they ignored it. Because empaths always believe they can fix it, until the moment they can't. The calm that terrifies. When the clarity event hits, outsiders expect chaos. They expect tears, screams, maybe even violence. But that's not what happens. The empaths become calm, too calm. It's as if a switch flips in their nervous system. Their emotional chaos turns to precision. Their empathy fuses with analysis, and what emerges is something both breathtaking and terrifying. Clarity sharper than a surgeon's scalpel. They don't attack, they don't rage, they simply start to speak truth, with surgical accuracy. They describe in chilling detail every manipulation, every lie, every emotional trap that's ever been used against them. They lay it out logically, cleanly, without malice. It's not revenge, it's revelation. It's the moment an empath integrates their shadow. Shadow integration in real time. I began to understand this through the lens of Jungian psychology. Shadow integration. The process of confronting and accepting the parts of ourselves we've been taught to suppress. For empaths, their shadow isn't rage or cruelty. It's their intelligence, their intuition, their power, the aspects of themselves they've been shamed for using. When betrayal forces them to stop denying those qualities, they fuse their compassion with discernment, their empathy with strength, their softness with strategy, and that's when everything changes. They become what I call psychologically complete. After the awakening, once an empath reaches this state, they never go back. They stop apologizing for having boundaries. They stop explaining their perceptions. They stop participating in relationships that drain them. They don't become cold. They become selective. I watched this transformation ripple through their lives. They left toxic relationships quietly, strategically. They severed ties with manipulative family members without drama. They built new lives based on authenticity and alignment. And the people who once preyed on their kindness, they began to feel uneasy around them. Predators know when their prey has evolved teeth. The predator's instinct. What fascinated me most was how predators, manipulative, controlling personalities, reacted to these awakened empaths. They avoided them. Instinctively. It was as if they could feel it, the end of their influence. The empath didn't even have to speak. Their energy alone said, "You can't feed on me anymore." I called this phenomenon the predator's instinct. A manipulator's subconscious recognizes when their usual tactics, guilt, gaslighting, emotional blackmail, will no longer work, and rather than risk exposure, they retreat. Because an awakened empath doesn't need to threaten or prove anything. Their presence alone exposes deception, the mirror effect. When I continued following these individuals, I saw how their transformation affected everyone around them. Families collapsed, but not because the empath destroyed them, because the empath stopped enabling dysfunction. Alcoholics were forced to face their addictions without emotional caretakers. Narcissists lost their supply. Depressed relatives could no longer rely on endless validation. The awakened empath had become a mirror, reflecting everyone's truth back to them, whether they liked it or not. Healthy people grew stronger in their presence. Toxic people unraveled. It was evolution happening in real time. The birth of the integrated empath. Over time, I began to see what this transformation truly meant. These individuals were not victims reborn. They were the next stage of human emotional evolution. They were integrated empaths, people capable of feeling everything without being consumed by it, of seeing everything without becoming cynical. They had mastered the balance between heart and mind, compassion and discernment, feeling and boundaries. And in that balance, they became something humanity rarely produces. People who can love deeply without losing themselves. The research that kept me awake at night. Even after years of studying these transformations, I couldn't stop thinking about them. The awakened empaths, these people who had gone through betrayal, collapse, and rebirth, seemed to defy every model of psychology I'd been trained in. When I followed up with them months and then years later, something extraordinary had happened. Their lives hadn't just improved, they had transcended what most would consider normal emotional functioning. They built thriving businesses because they could read what clients really needed before those clients even said it. They built fulfilling relationships because they could sense emotional manipulation instantly and shut it down before it began. They made almost flawless decisions because they trusted their own intuitive data more than anyone else's advice. What I realized made my blood run cold. These empaths hadn't lost their sensitivity. They had refined it into precision. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they'd once been manipulated, but they chose not to. The ethical awakening. That was the turning point for me as a clinician, because I understood something terrifying. If an empath learns to wield their emotional intelligence consciously, they possess one of the most powerful psychological tools imaginable. Imagine a person who can read your insecurities, your motives, your unspoken desires, and your guilt, all within minutes. Now imagine they've learned to integrate that perception with analytical reasoning and boundaries. That's not a victim. That's a strategist with a heart. What astounded me, though, was that these transformed empaths rarely used this gift for harm. They didn't seek revenge, they didn't manipulate to control, they simply walked away. They removed themselves from toxic systems without a word. And in doing so, they dismantled those systems completely. Because when you stop playing a game, the manipulator has no game left to play. The new kind of power. In my private notes, I described these individuals as balanced warriors. They weren't violent, they weren't even confrontational, but their very presence disrupted manipulation. Others could feel it. That this person saw them too clearly. The awakened empath doesn't need to announce their power. Others can sense it in their bones. It's an energetic warning that says, I see you fully and I can't be used. That's what every manipulator fears most. A person who both understands them and no longer needs anything from them. This balance between understanding and detachment is the empath's final evolution. It's the moment they stop confusing kindness with compliance, and it's the moment they finally embody their strength. When systems collapse, the transformation of even a single empath can destabilize an entire family system. I watched this play out countless times. When the empath stopped absorbing everyone else's emotions, the family dynamic collapsed, not because they destroyed it, but because they refused to enable it any longer. The alcoholic father suddenly had no one left to confide his shame to. The narcissistic sibling lost their audience. The chronically depressed parent had to face their pain without emotional hand-holding. Every manipulative system depends on someone to absorb the fallout. When the empath steps out, the entire structure implodes. It's not chaos, it's cleansing. The empath's mirror effect. Through my continued research, I started calling this the empath's mirror effect. These transformed individuals no longer needed to confront or argue. Their energy itself reflected truth so starkly that people couldn't hide behind illusions anymore. Manipulators felt exposed. Authentic people felt safe. The empath became a kind of walking truth detector. Not through judgment, but through presence. What struck me most was that these people didn't have to do anything. Just being near them made others feel their own unresolved issues surface. It was as if their clarity projected clarity onto everyone around them. That's when I realized the awakened empath isn't just healed. They become a catalyst for the healing of others when empaths surpass their teachers. At one point, I began introducing my transformed patients to other clients during group therapy sessions, purely to observe interactions. What happened next shocked even me. Within minutes, these awakened empaths could identify the psychological wounds of others, their exact trauma origins, defense mechanisms, and even the type of therapy they'd respond best to. Their accuracy outperformed seasoned clinicians with decades of training, and it created a profound ethical dilemma for me. If a person without formal education could develop such precision, what did that mean for the field of psychology itself? Were these people simply gifted, or were they demonstrating the next stage of human emotional evolution? I couldn't shake that question, documenting the transformation. To understand what was really happening, I began developing what I called the Integration Observation Protocol, a framework for charting the empath's transformation from wounded sensitivity to awakened intelligence. It wasn't traditional therapy, it was documentation, an attempt to understand how, under extreme betrayal and psychological stress, certain empaths naturally evolved into conscious strategists. I noticed 3 consistent stages across nearly all my cases. Recognition. The empath realizes that their emotions are not weaknesses but data points. They stop pathologizing their feelings and begin seeing their perception as evidence, not error. Integration. They merge what I called their light and shadow aspects. This means allowing anger, strength, and logic to exist alongside compassion. They stop trying to be only good and instead become whole. Application, the final stage. Here, the empath begins to use their emotional intelligence strategically, not defensively. They read rooms, people, and systems like maps. They understand where energy is flowing and where it's being stolen. And when they reach this stage, they become immune to psychological abuse. They don't stop loving. They just stop leaking. Compassion with boundaries. The most profound discovery from my decades of notes was that the awakened empath doesn't lose their compassion. They refine it. They become selectively generous. They can still love deeply, but they now recognize who deserves that love. They offer empathy as a choice, not an obligation. This balance, compassion paired with discernment, is what makes them so powerful. They can comfort the innocent and confront the manipulative all in the same breath. They can be kind without being exploited, strong without being cruel. I began to see these individuals not as anomalies, but as templates for the future of human emotional intelligence, because their evolution wasn't accidental. It was necessary. The evolutionary perspective. When I analyzed all my data, I realized something breathtaking. Empaths weren't maladapted for modern society, as many had assumed. They were evolutionarily advanced individuals living in environments that punished their gifts. Their emotional bandwidth was higher, their pattern recognition faster, their capacity for moral discernment sharper. The problem wasn't that they felt too much. It was that society wasn't built to handle people who could see through its illusions. Empaths were never meant to be broken. They were meant to awaken. And betrayal, as cruel as it is, turned out to be the key that unlocked their full potential. The double-edged sword, but I also had to confront a darker truth. If an empath goes through shadow integration without grounding in ethics or compassion, their insight can become predatory. They can become master manipulators using the same perception that once saved them to control others. This was the nightmare scenario that haunted me. To address it, I began designing what I called the ethical integration model, a framework to ensure that awakened empaths use their abilities for healing, not harm. Because emotional intelligence without ethics is just another form of power abuse. And I knew too well how destructive that could be. Hidden notes and unpublished work. I never published my full findings during my lifetime. I spread them across journals coded in fragments scattered among case notes. I was afraid that someone might weaponize what I'd discovered. Because if someone learned how to deliberately trigger empathic awakening through engineered betrayal, it could become a psychological weapon. But I also knew that, used wisely, this knowledge could help thousands of sensitive people reclaim their power. I've come to believe that the awakened empath is humanity's next great evolutionary step, a bridge between emotion and intellect, intuition and logic, compassion and sovereignty. They are what we become when we stop being afraid of our own sensitivity. The balanced warrior. In their final phase of transformation, the awakened empaths I studied became what I called balanced warriors, humans capable of exquisite tenderness and unshakable strength in equal measure. They no longer reacted from emotion. They responded from understanding. They didn't avoid pain, nor did they let it consume them. Instead, they saw pain as information, a signal, not a sentence. These individuals lived in a state of awareness most people only glimpse in rare moments of clarity. They could perceive deception instantly, not because they distrusted everyone, but because they trusted themselves completely. They didn't need to prove anything. They didn't need validation. Their peace came from perception itself. Life after integration, as I followed these awakened empaths over years, a remarkable pattern emerged. Every one of them rebuilt their lives from the ground up. They chose work that aligned with their values. They formed relationships rooted in mutual respect. They cultivated peace, not because life was suddenly easy, but because they refused to negotiate their worth again. Their happiness was no longer dependent on approval. They had finally learned the art of selective empathy, to give their emotional energy only to what deserved it. This was not coldness, it was clarity, because love without boundaries is not compassion, it's consumption. The ripple effect, these transformations didn't happen in isolation. Each awakened empath triggered a kind of emotional evolution in their surroundings. Their newfound presence forced everyone around them to choose, grow, or reveal their dysfunction. Healthy people rose to the occasion. They matched the empath's integrity and flourished. Toxic people, however, couldn't stand it. They tried to pull the empath back into old patterns, only to find that the hooks no longer worked. It was astonishing to witness. Simply by being authentic, these empaths became living mirrors, reflecting back the truth of those they encountered. Manipulators crumbled under that reflection. Authentic souls, however, found peace within it. It was the purest form of transformation, one person's wholeness inspiring another's awakening. When truth becomes presence. One of the most haunting discoveries in my research was how truth itself began to emanate from these people. Their presence alone altered the behavior of others. Those with hidden motives would falter in conversation. Those burdened by guilt would grow restless. Those with integrity would feel seen and soothed. The awakened empath didn't speak truth anymore. They embodied it. And in that embodiment, they became immune to manipulation. You cannot gaslight someone who trusts their perception absolutely. You cannot control someone who no longer seeks your approval. You cannot. They could die off because their suffering wasn't proof of weakness. It was evidence of sensitivity in a world that rewards numbness. But once they learned to manage that sensitivity consciously, to use it rather than be used by it, they became something the human species desperately needs. Emotionally intelligent leaders. The future, I believe, belongs to them. The final stage, return to service. In the last phase of integration, almost every awakened empath felt a pull to give back. One day, in the end, they are